Hi, y'all. We'll just give y'all a couple seconds to keep coming in. Okay. Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Public Interest Environmental Law Conference. Thank you for coming to our panel on wildfire management in the Pyrocene. My name is Carly Buchanan, and I am just a PILC volunteer, and I'll be moderating this panel. I have a few announcements, and then we'll get started. So don't worry if you can't see yourself. This is a Zoom webinar, so all the attendees are automatically muted with videos off. So you'll only be able to see the panelists and myself. Throughout the panel, if you have a question, please use the Q&A function rather than the chat function. We'll be able to see your questions as they come in. The panelists will give their presentation, and then there'll be a 10 to 15 minute Q&A session at the end where we'll answer your questions. Please remember to be courteous to all viewpoints throughout the presentation and the Q&A session. Also, our alumni board, Friends of Land, Air, Water, helps to provide stipends for students during unpaid public interest environmental law internships. If you are interested in making a donation to help provide students with those stipends, information to do so will be on a Google document, which I'll drop in the link in the chat. Lastly, the University of Oregon is located on Kalapuya-Ilihi, the traditional indigenous homelands of the Kalapuya people. Following treaties between 1851 and 1855, the Kalapuya people were dispossessed of their indigenous homeland by the United States government and forcibly removed to the Coast Reservation in Western Oregon. Today, descendants of the citizens of the Confederated Tribes of Grand Bond Community of Oregon and the Confederated Tribes of the Siletz Indians of Oregon, and continue to make important contributions in their communities at UO and across the land we now refer to as Oregon. PILC would like to acknowledge the traditional homelands of the Kalapuya peoples and the Willamette Valley and express our respect for the tribal nations of Oregon. We introduce our panel. So Timothy Ingalsbee is the executive director and co-founder of FUSEE. He started his fire career as a wildland firefighter for both the U.S. Forest Service and National Park Service, and is now a certified senior wildland fire ecologist. He earned his PhD in environmental sociology with a graduate certificate in nonprofit management from the University of Oregon, where he is also an adjunct instructor and faculty research associate. Tim has founded and directed several nonprofit organizations and is devoted to fire ecology research, education, and advocacy on behalf of forest conservation. He was named Oregon's Conservationist of the Year in 1993. So, Mr. Ingalsbee, I'll pass it off to you.
Thank you. I'm going to share my screen. And start the slideshow. And can you see the slides all right? Great. Well, I've been coming to PILC for a long time, and it's always a thrill. This is the third year in a row we've been remote. I hope the last, and I look forward to seeing everyone literally, not just virtually, next year. I do regret that my colleague Michael Beasley, who was going to be a co-panelist, was not able to make it. So you're stuck with me going solo. Anyway, I'm executive director of Firefighters United for Safety, Ethics, and Ecology. Our acronym is pronounced FUSEE because FUSEEs are the handheld torches that wildland firefighters carry around in their packs for lighting fires of various sorts and for various objectives. So welcome to the Pyrocene. This is a term coined by Dr. Stephen Pine in his most recent book. It's where the Anthropocene is, you might say, measured by fire. And it's not news to most people here, but we have climate chaos measured by increased temperatures globally and locally, decreased relative humidity, facing stronger, more erratic winds. The Labor Day windstorm of 2020 was a continental climate-driven windstorm event that that spanned British Columbia to Baja, Mexico, and every ignition was kicked up. It became a large fire. Many power lines were down, including a fire just east of Eugene, the Holiday Farm fire, and it was that was definitely a climate driven wildfire. We're also having less snowpack. It's falling later in the fall and melting out earlier in spring. Right now we're having a rain on snow event in Oregon. And so we're having longer fire seasons due to climate change. In fact, some areas like California, there really isn't a season of fire anymore. Ignitions can happen any time of year. Prolonged droughts, it's coming out that we're perhaps in the midst of a mega drought in the Southwest, longer and stronger than anything in over 1,000 years. More storms as well, lightning storms from the increased temperature and energy in the atmosphere. There's hurricanes becoming more frequent and fiercer, tornadoes and such. And all these either create fuels or ignite fuels. And that's the issue when it comes to fire is fuels. That's what fires burn in. So all these climate and weather phenomenon are increasing the dryness of fuels, making them more available to ignite and burn. If they're not buried with snow, then they're dry, they're able to ignite and burn. Getting more insect and disease outbreaks that stress out trees and vegetation. And so what's happening is that any ignition is easy to start a fire, and then it's extremely rapid rate of spread. Embers are igniting new fires ahead of the flame front, and it's just the wildfires are kind of hopscotching across the landscape and leaping over fire lines, rivers, ridges, roads, whatever used to contain them. And we're seeing more extreme fire behavior with high intensity fires, high severity fires, very large scale fires. So what we have is megafires as a global phenomenon, from the Arctic to Amazonia, from Australia to Cascadia. We're having a global increase in wildfire activity, and we can call this the Pyrocene. So I would argue the dominant specter of climate change here in the Western US is wildfire. It's not so much melting glaciers or ice caps or rising seas or other storms like hurricanes. It's wildfire. And wildfire, a dramatic event that can happen in anyone's backyard out here in the West. And so with wildfire, the dominant image of climate change, the dominant image of wildfire are burning homes and incinerated neighborhoods. And that's what is beamed to us frequently in the media. And why that is because people have been sprawling into danger, moving into fire-prone environments, and just not prepared for that. I've got some statistics over here. In the last 15 years, we're approaching probably when they tally up the toll from last year's wildfires, we probably have approached or surpassed 90,000 structures destroyed during wildfires. And over the 15-year span, a couple thousand communities have had a fire 100 acres or greater within 2 miles of the town, which is within reach of embers being lofted in the sky, dropping down on rooftops and such. Half the population in the Western US lives in what's called the wildland urban interface zone, where wildland vegetation abuts human structures. And so what really is fueling the crisis over wildfires, I would say, is the danger to homes and communities. And then another factor in the crisis is fire exclusion, beginning with Euro-American colonization that forcibly removed indigenous peoples from their lands and brutally repressed their ability to steward the land with fire and employ cultural burning. Along with that, so it's your fires that would have, could have, should have been put in by human hands, as they have for millennia, suddenly stopped. And then land use changes with urbanization and agriculture that also formed kind of breaks to the ability of fire to spread across the landscapes. And then last but not least, or perhaps least, wildfire suppression. But fire exclusion, the result of the fires that we put out and fires we failed to put in. Now, it may not seem like this because in the news media, we have this perception that we have an overabundance of fire, these large wildfires. Last year, 4 million acres burned in California alone. That's just unprecedented within recent memory. 4 million acres used to burn on average annually prior to Euro-American settlement. So a colleague of mine, Dr. Michael Medler from Western Washington University, has kind of, the pyrogeographers tallied up the amount of historic fire deficit. And he's calculated about 26, a little over 26 million acres per year on average burned, are needed to burn annually in order to maintain these fire dependent species and fire adapted habitats in forests and grassland ecosystems. Now, up until the 1950s, we hit that mark of between 20 and 40 million acres burned on average annually in the US. On the left is a archived Smokey Bear poster. Hard to find these days, but you know, coming from the 1940s or late 40s, reminder, yeah, 30 million acres burned last year, and it might burn again. But following World War II, in the beginning of the 1950s, 30 million acres crashed to just 3 million acres. Now it's been ticking up since 2000, about 7 million acres burned on average. In 2017 and 2020, there it was 10 million acres, and it was like suddenly there was a crisis, and people freaking out. We just have this kind of amnesia of when there was a lot more fire in the land and there was no crisis. So Dr. Medler has calculated what's the average annual fire deficit that would have, could have, should have burned if not for these other factors. It comes out to about 12 million acres per year in the Western 11 states, missing vital regenerative burning for the sake of these fire-dependent species and fire-adapted ecosystems. So we've been attempting to fight fires by federal firefighting forces since early 1900s, but we were not exactly effective. We really didn't have much reach into the more remote wildlands. Our tools are fairly primitive. This is a crew from the early 1930s. And you can see they're basically working with hand tools. There's a misery whip right there. And they weren't exactly that effective in encircling and extinguishing, eliminating fire from very remote wildlands and densely forested areas. But a reminder that the period of fire exclusion predates even the period of attempted fire suppression, when indigenous burning was ceased. So, yes, we've been fighting fires for 100 years, but not all of that very effectively. Following World War II, though, we started, introducing lots of machines, a lot of war surplus machines following the end of the Korean War. And we're, charging in, accessing the forest more with logging roads and all kinds of machines, from chainsaws to log trucks and dozers and jeeps, helicopters. This is a stage photo, by the way, seeing the kind of range of different firefighting machines and equipment. This has to be one take shot. In the background, you can see a smoke jumper, and how, just have one shot to get that all in the frame. But following World War II, we started being successful, with air quotes, in dramatically reducing the amount of area burned every year. And part of this was that this period of sudden intrusion of logging roads, logging, mechanized firefighting, coincided with natural climate variability. This cool, moist period, we call it the Pacific Decadal Oscillation. It's this shift between El Nino and La Nina seasons. But you can see in this graph here in the middle, in that period from the late 40s on into the 1980s, cooler, moisture conditions made it easier for humans to put out wildfires. Then starting in the 1980s, we shifted into a more warmer, drier climate, natural climate variability, but this is now amplified with human-caused climate change, adding more fossil fuel emissions into the atmosphere, warming and drying the atmosphere even more. And so you'll see the bar graphs are prior to the 1950s, lots of wildfire activities. These are bar graphs measured in tens of millions of hectares. And then it dips down, and now it's rising up again. And so again, we have a historic fire deficit. We are chipping away at that, but now the conditions for these fires burning somewhat different than when they burned in the past. Now, this is every rural homeowner's dream, that in case of fire, your home will be ringed by crews, your Type 1 engines and hand crews, air tanker dropping retardant in your backyard. And, that just is a kind of a dream that's somewhat a fantasy, because a single wildfire front can simultaneously threaten hundreds of homes. And we just don't have all the resources to protect every single home like this. And what's even more remarkable about this image is that the location of this home puts it at extra risk. It's evidently on a steep slope covered with brush, almost right up to the doorstep, very flammable brush. In the background is a power line that is a notorious source of ignition. And there's only so much and so little that these crews can do to, directly protect that home. Now, if only firefighters could stage nearby homes and communities, but what's happening is they're being sent out into remote wildlands. They're covered in the entire landscape, and just spread real thin, trying to fight every fire that appears on the landscape near or far from homes and communities. This is a remarkable image. This is on the edge of the Ventana Wilderness area in the 2016 Soberanes fire. And you see this, large air tanker dropping retardant. Well, if you look just to the right of that, there is a dozer line, a fire line cut with bulldozers. And that the crew in the orange suits are an inmate crew of firefighters that Cal Fire has put to work there. That retardant is being dropped outside of the fire, outside of the fire line. The fire is actually to the right of the line in the wilderness area. And it's dropping it out. It's not really intended to engage the fire. It's just another hedging, in case the fire leaps over that bulldozer line, maybe it'll slow down a little bit. But that Soberanes fire and its time was the most expensive wild firefighting incident in U.S. history. It just burned millions of dollars per day, and a lot of it doing this far away from any home or community, keeping the fires from burning out of the wilderness or in the wilderness. it's just evident. It wasn't really about protecting homes and communities. It was just about fighting all fires anywhere. And this area retardant, it you know, it causes impacts. When it runs into the river, it kills fish, amphibians, other riparian species, and dropped in the ground. It, you know, they used to boast that the retardant acts like fertilizer to get a head start on the, you know, regeneration. Well, what takes most advantage of these aggressive invasive weeds? And people have tracked these kind of bursts of invasive weed hotspots deep in wilderness areas by looking where the retardant dropped. And sure enough, there's a bloom coming next season or what. And in addition to large air tankers, there's these other mechanized machines like bulldozers, very expensive to run, can be very inappropriate depending on where they're located, running over streams, around very erosive slopes or soils, fragile ridge lines, and very ineffective. I failed to point out, but at the bottom are some of the reports where we talk about, you can find on our website, and just massive soil disturbance. And along with that, these fire lines that sometimes they go across alongside roads. They'll clear cut alongside roads to widen this line. This is an example from a fire in Idaho, in which the wildfire itself was miles away, heading the other direction. And they just carved this fire line, improved and widened the logging road and logged adjacent to it. And that just increases the fragmentation effects of roads. And for, you know, not certain what purpose, what benefit there. The fire never did reach this fire line. And what's going to happen in that clear cut is it's probably going to be, you know, full of invasive weeds. It's got a fair amount of slash right there, but it's just, you know, we have to question. And I'm not sure about this location, but many of these logging roads were built to access big timber. They weren't built to manage fire. So, you know, kind of switchbacking up across the mid slope of a steep mountainside full of trees and other vegetation, very not very effective in stopping wildfire spread, you know, especially in the conditions they're burning these days. Here's another aspect of dozers building these huge expansive safety zones in case firefighters have to retreat because they're working way in remote wildland areas. If they have to run away from the flames, they build these ginormous safety zones that, you know, that's a clear cut by any other name. And long after the effects of the fire are you know, recovered from that, this is going to be a big scar in the land for quite some time. And so the effects of fire on the land are transient. The green up occurs sometimes, you know, green stuff starts popping up out of the ash before the smoke is fully cleared. That's an immediate response in some areas. A few years later, you know, all kinds of things are growing out of the ground. It may be difficult to know, hey, the fire actually burned across this area, depending on the site. And but you know, where it's the effects of fire are most severe, most extreme, typically are in these clear-cut tree farms, these timber plantations, where they stock up the ground just super dense, as thick as they can, with as many trees, you know, stems per acre to maximize future profits when they come to log that land. But it's just one big ball of fuel that just, you know, the most flammable part of a conifer tree is this needle mass, and it's just interlacing crowns right down to the ground, and it just goes whoosh up in a big fireball. And so that's of those cleared areas in the hillside you're seeing. Those are the moonscapes that come from burning clear cuts, burning timber plantations. And you see desperate attempts to keep fire out of it with all these dozer lines. Well, they were not successful. Fire easily breached them. And once it gets into these dense timber farms, it just screams across the land. And so, were we to take an image of this today, this was from the car fire. It'd probably be green. Things are growing back, even in that burnt clear cut. But those dozer lines will be there for a long, long time, scouring the land. So what's the case? And you don't get this perception. It's like our firefighters are heroes. They control fire. They control nature. Is that these megafires and extreme fire behavior events? They're climate and weather driven. They burn fuels, yes, but it's the climate and weather that really drives large fires, and that they burn so large because they burn so fast. Not necessarily so hot. Well, there are patches where it does burn very hot, but they burn so fast. Again, these embers are kicked up and land on hot, dry fuels, plenty of wind. And so it's just this kind of cascading fire spread that it spreads faster than crews can get out in front and try to stop them. So what scientists have found that large fires essentially define their own boundaries. They make these runs and then they rest. And it's during those quiescent periods when they rest, that's when crews kind of get out there and cut their fire lines and claim victory over these large fires. But it's like the Lilliputans capturing Gulliver after he lay down and fell asleep. Okay, that's kind of how we do it. Without those change in weather conditions, firefighters have to back off, sometimes way off, and maybe burn out in between themselves and the fire. But we really have reached our limits of human ability to kind of control, capture fire on the land, especially during these extreme weather conditions that are becoming more frequent and prolonged due to climate change. So this is kind of take-home message. Our 21st century climate is rapidly, if not finally, ended the efficacy of 20th century firefighting strategy and tactics. What can this poor firefighter do with a hose and a wall of flame like that? This is a very common view here. The firefighters make an heroic attempt to go direct attack and have to run away. This is another inmate crew in California. Stock photo. You could recycle this every year. It's an annual emergency in California because, we're just set ourselves up to do that. So enter the U.S. Forest Service's wildfire crisis strategy that was announced a few weeks ago. This is the cover photo of that document. It's, I guess it's very propagandistic, meant to stoke kind of patriotic feelings of resilience. The spirit of American people will rise up from the ashes and we will overcome the forces of wild nature. But I see a lot of tragedy here because this was fully predicted. Science has been predicting the increase of wildfire activity and the vulnerability of rural communities for 20 years or more. But anyway, the wildfire crisis strategy, it centers on fuels reduction and forest health treatments, using about $6 billion from the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act passed by Congress, the bipartisan infrastructure bill. It's promising to treat 20 million acres on Forest Service lands over the next 10 years. And add to that 30 million acres on federal, state, tribal, private lands over the next 10 years. And it's in a kind of typical use it or lose it mentality. It just got dumped with a bunch of money and it better show some progress to Congress and people quick. The Forest Service is going to start with shovel-ready projects. It's very similar to the stimulus bill during the Obama administration used to pull us or avoid a depression, pull us out of the Great Recession in 2009. Shovel-ready projects. Whether or not they're really the most effective and efficient, wise use of taxpayer dollars, whether or not they even incorporate reality of climate change and foresee future conditions. Shovel-ready projects, they've had NEPA done. And so these are pretty much standard, conventional, run-of-the-mill, if you will, fuels reduction projects, very emphasizing whatever kind of commercial extraction can happen, either, saw logs or biomass or whatever. That's kind of what drives a lot of the Forest Service's projects. Where can you get some money or make some money for contractors? It's going to prioritize key watersheds in California, Oregon, Colorado, Idaho, and Arizona. They've been mapped. So whereas the shovel-ready projects are just all over the place, there's no real strategy to them other than, okay, where can we generate some revenue? The plan seeks to shift to some kind of strategy. Where are the fire risks or the fuel hazards, greater, and may warrant some focus. A lot of focus on forest thinning, mechanical treatments. I have many colleagues in the forest conservation movement who just, again, what's called thinning is actually logging, and there's issues with that. And, mechanical treatments is the priority, but that in our kind of steep, mountainous, remote wildland areas, there's not that many places that machines can roll, and certainly not really can roll profitably unless they're extracting something that is often counterproductive with what you're trying to protect. Try to protect the forest. Well, it's just the old strategy. How do you reduce wildfires? By removing trees. That's just kind of counterproductive. So a lot of focus still on forest thinning, mechanical treatments. There is some statements that prescribe fire treatments will follow the logging and cutting, but I put this question mark because we hear that a lot. And in my opinion, a fuels reduction treatment is not completed until there is application of fire. So I don't mean to be cynical, because we are in a crisis, and homes and communities are vulnerable, unprepared, and people are suffering, and some our ecosystems are suffering as well. Because we've created conditions where fires are burning not as natural or characteristic as the plants and animals have evolved and adapted to. So, but let's do the time warp again. In this document, it's talking about the forest health crisis. This still goes back to 1990, when here in the Pacific Northwest, old growth clear cutting was restricted, not fully eliminated, but restricted because it was driving ancient forest species extinct. And it was just like, the Forest Service pivoted from, logging to get the cut out to logging to put the fire out, and claiming a forest health crisis came, and then that kind of morphed into this hazardous fuels hysteria, where the focus was allegedly not on timber, but tinder, and dealing with all that. And the whole forest was some, powder keg of hazardous fuels. But, again, looking for commercial extraction, the focus of hazardous fuels reduction for decades was yanking out logs, the least flammable portion of a tree, dumping all the limbs and needles on the ground, the most flammable portion of a tree. It wasn't really reducing hazardous fuels, it was simply relocating them from the ground to the ground. And then all this kind of fuel break frenzy. The Quincy Library Group project was a great example of hundreds of miles of these clear-cut corridors, splicing and dicing up the landscape, where again, the promise was, well, this will be where future firefighters will be staged and have pre-cut fire lines that would be safer for them. And by and large, they were rarely if ever used. Even worse, they were never maintained. So we've had a long history of these grandiose fuel break systems cut, and they just, once you get the cut out, there's no economic incentive to go back and maintain them. And so something grows back in those disturbed areas and increase, soil disturbance and sunlight. Typically what grew back was more flammable than the original forest cover. As well, lawless logging riders. We've had a series of, forest health crises of one sort or another. Congress tries to intervene, mandating cut levels, trying to restrict environmental laws, short circuit NEPA processes, which are supposed to require some scientific environmental analysis of the impacts of projects, some inclusion of public comment. And then that's just seems cumbersome. Bureaucratic paperwork that's just charge ahead with the project. So that's a lot what this wildfire crisis strategy appears as. Let's do the time warp again. Let's go right back decades earlier, where of all the factors that are affecting increased wildfire activity, climate change, and homes and communities, 84% of all wildfire ignitions are caused by people or are human caused, power lines. Majority of fires that burn homes and communities start on private lands, not on Forest Service lands. If anything, they start on private lands or state lands that burn onto Forest Service lands. And even the majority of wildfires are not even forest fires. They burn in shrublands or grasslands. But a lot of the focus, again, is like, where can we get some trees? We're focused on removing trees to reduce wildfires. So, and the wildfire crisis strategy is just continues this focus on fire exclusion and aggressive suppression, the obsolete paradigm. And so I'm sad to report, in my opinion, the Forest Service's wildfire crisis strategy is really a fuel strategy, not a fire strategy. And there's a difference. So the Forest Service is not alone. I mean, it is actually, kind of part goaded on by very powerful political and economic interests with vested stakes in fire exclusion and commercial timber extraction and industrial mechanized firefighting. A couple California congressmen just a few days ago dropped a bill, HR 6903, calling for, let's bring back the 10 a.m. policy, where it's aggressive initial attack on all unplanned fires within 1 day of detection, and all monitoring of fires, perhaps in wilderness areas or rural areas, and any management of fire for ecological objectives. Just send out every available federal, state, local firefighting resource, attack all fires in all places at all times at any cost. And it's, their claims are that it's the lack of active forest management, AKA logging, that's the cause of these destructive wildfires. So I would say it's the lack of active fire management that is part of fire exclusion and part of the wildfire crisis. But this is, Forest Service not alone. There are many powerful policymakers and opinion makers that pine for the glory days of yore, when we could, hit those fires hard, put them out quick, keep them small. Yeah, that was, in the 1950s. But those conditions, climatic conditions, weather conditions, social conditions, are not the same now. Won't be. This poor crew member is basically attacking this fire with a squirt gun. Okay, so much for the war on wildfire. I think we lost. So there are redeemable parts of this wildfire crisis strategy. Beginning with the promise to focus on key fire sheds, which are mapped. Instead of what the Forest Service has done for decades, kind of randomized projects wherever they can get a little revenue out, that's where we'll do a fuels treatment. no strategy in mind of like where would fires even encounter that fuel project. And science just to realize barely 1%, at most 4% of most existing fuel treatments never encounter a wildfire. That means 96% of all these fuels reduction treatments pretty much wasted when it comes to affecting fire spread. And so they're kind of randomized treatments with no real strategy other than revenue and receipt. They're going to focus on these key fire sheds where the fire risks are greater, where the effects of fire exclusion are greater, and there is some merit in that. And they're going to work at a landscape scale. I mean, they boast 1 to 3 million acres of fuels reduction treatments, and wildfires are burning at a pace and scale that just surpasses any ability to kind of get out ahead of it with just a million or just a few million acres of treatments. They recognize the need to build a multi-organizational workforce, build the workforce capacity. The Forest Service alone cannot solve the wildfire crisis. And it's kind of stunning that it developed its wildfire crisis strategy alone. As far as I know, it didn't really involve Department of Interior agencies like the National Park Service or Bureau of Land Management or Fish and Wildlife Service. Didn't really involve state forestry departments or anyone, any other stakeholders. It just kind of stovepiped this strategy and came out alone. But it is making at least claims that we need a multi-organizational workforce, basically all hands dealing with it, and build a multi-jurisdictional coalition, because wildfire doesn't respect property boundaries. It burns, from one land ownership to another. So basically all lands. And then it's kind of puts the onus back on society that people are going to have to make some big changes in the way they choose to live in fire-prone areas. They're going to have to live with fire in the land of one sort or another. Prescribed fire or wildfire. There's really no absolute prevention. And as I've argued, no absolute suppression of fires in the conditions here. So basically all options. This is the cohesive strategy. All lands, all hands, all options on the table in trying to resolve the wildfire crisis. But, with every, I'm given some credit, but there's a fair amount of lip service to a paradigm shift. A couple quotes coming right out of the document. One is acknowledgement that there's it's ironically, part of the problem is a deficit of the right kinds of wildfire. And some of that bad old firefighting of the past that's still ongoing is part of that problem. But they don't really confront that. There's not really a mea culpa about that. But it will take a paradigm shift in land management across federal, state, private, tribal boundaries to reduce the risk to people and restore fire ecosystems. Music to my ears. But landscape scale mechanical fuel treatments without broadcast burning is more the same fire exclusion. It's simply running faster and farther in the wrong direction. More fire exclusion, we need to turn it around and start thinking about fire inclusion and fire restoration. And what I basically come to the conclusion is the wildfire crisis strategy, if implemented as articulated, is just going to be like spinning on a treadmill, going faster and faster, getting nowhere. And it just still these dedicated fuels reduction for fire suppression and fire exclusion. It's just, it will be treadmilling tragedy, a real tremendous waste of money and resources. So in FUSEE, that's our motto. We're torchbearers for a new fire management paradigm. And we advocate that we stop fighting all wildfires, start working with fire. Prescribed fire, wildfire, and with the goal of maximizing the socio-ecological objectives and benefits of burning, and mitigating the health hazards, the safety risks of people and property, and minimizing taxpayer costs and the environmental impacts of these aggressive mechanized chemical fire suppression tactics that we chart out last century. So that's what FUSEE does. Promotes safe, ethical, ecological fire management. And we're inspired by all the Leopold's land ethic. Thing is right when it tends to preserve the integrity, stability, and beauty of the biotic community, is wrong when it tends otherwise. We have adapted that to a Leopoldian fire ethic. A thing is right when it contributes to the safety of firefighters and the public, ethical use of public resources, environmental protection of fire-adapted landscapes, and ecological restoration of fire-dependent ecosystems. It is wrong when it tends otherwise. So in our, like the fire triangle that some of you are familiar with, of heat and oxygen and fuel, that what gets the fire going, you take one of those legs of the triangle out and it collapses. We have the FUSEE triangle of safety, ethics, and ecology. Safety is number one, but ethics are at the heart of our mission. But we recognize that ecology is the bottom line. And you try to take one of those out, degrade the ecosystem to make it safe for firefighters, and that system's not going to function. It's going to collapse. Very unethical. So we want to think holistically in terms of socio-ecological systems, all integrated in one. People living in fire-prone environments. So this image, horrible image from Santa Rosa on the left, typically viewed as a social disaster, it's an ecological hazard. It's an ecological hazard, number one, because that is one massive hazmat site of toxic ash and waste, polluting the air, the water, traumatizing people. And it's a tragedy. And it's just horrible. This image on the right, typically framed as a ecological disaster, this giant tree, this ancient tree elder, dropped during the firefighting, and the others, salvage logged afterwards. It's a social disaster. That's part of our human legacy, our living legacy. These are the elders that, this forlorn environmentalist, there's a loss there. I'm at a loss of words how to explain. It's a social disaster. So what we advocate is, instead of continued fire exclusion, we want ecological fire use, which is not let burn. It's not passive. It's not just, watch it. I mean, it is predicated on monitoring, but monitoring is actively watching and learning and gathering data. That's, doing science, if you will, in management, and very, very important to kind of ground truth a lot of our models in fire college. And crews are standing by, ready to engage if needed to keep fires, in some kind of modest control, either spatially or by intensity, but managing for protection of lives and property, number one, but as well managing the fire for these restoration objectives as well. Active management, we're going to resurrect kind of loose herding of fires, fire guiding instead of firefighting, try to steer the fire, and with the best tools of weather prediction and fuels, fire spread modeling and mapping, we can do some modest techniques to slow down fire spread or speed it up, depending on what needs to happen. Not always trying to stop it and put it out cold, but working with it instead of fighting against it. Working with the natural barriers on the terrain to kind of channel fire spread within fire sheds. That's a very progressive. Doing more point protection, staging crews to directly protect homes, communities, important infrastructure, cell phone towers or whatever. Point protection while allowing the fire to spread around it. And instead of trying to do perimeter control, corral every fire, encircle it and extinguish it, working with time and space as fires burn instead of against it. And this new paradigm, a new model of ecological fire use, ecological fire management, is going to need a new identity. Instead of calling firefighters, that's a misnomer and soon to be obsolete. We're advocating calling fire rangers, where they're more like stewards and soldiers, more like fire management workers than warriors. Call them fire lighters or fire guiders, but they really be kind of front line of restoring these degraded ecosystems, suffering from fire exclusion, protecting these rural homes and communities that are unprepared and vulnerable to fire. And more taking on the identity of land healers than, fighters. And I think if one thing I hope we learn from this pandemic, that healers can be heroes too. And so to be a fire ranger is not just a job, it's an adventure, doing some of the same activities as we do for fighting fires, but with entirely different objectives, entirely different spirit and mentality. And we look for that. So bottom line, take home message, 20th century fire exclusion paradigm, and focus on logging and firefighting is not a viable solution to either the wildfire crisis or the climate crisis. The Forest Service's wildfire crisis strategy is stuck in the decadent, dying, but not yet dead, obsolete paradigm of fire exclusion. Even though they've strapped on in the final pages kind of lip service to reintroducing fire, prescribed fire or whatever. But in our 21st century climate, forests are a vital part of the solution to climate recovery. They're the planet's organs for soaking up carbon in the sky and sinking it into the soil, like fossil fuel emissions in reverse. As well, fire is part of the solution to forest carbon storage, and that stabilizing some of these forest ecosystems that are unstable because of fire exclusion and some of the fuels accumulation. That's a different talk, but the key insight. And so I'm going to advocate in this last second year that forest and climate activists need to focus on the real burning issue of our time. It's not it's not wildfires as much as fossil fuel emissions. I mean, Dr. Stephen Pine argues, I think convincingly, that perhaps never before in Earth's geologic history have we seen so much combustion, but so little open flame. The combination of burning fossil fuels, fossilized forests, burning them, sending their effluents into the sky, and yet excluding fires as indigenous people carefully steward land with fire for millennia. And that's been robbed from their culture and from the ecosystem. And then fire crews putting out fires. And we only are successful with the small fires burning under cool, moist conditions, the ones we should be managing because they're doing good work for free. Those are the ones we put out. The ones we don't put out, well, we kind of run away, back off, and then hope for the weather conditions to change and get a handle on those large fires. In my opinion, and I'm sad to report, the Forest Service's wildfire crisis strategy as it's currently articulated, and perhaps soon to be implemented, is more of the same kind of run-of-the-mill mechanized timber extraction, timber reduction, fighting fires, excluding fire. Really, the solution is empower indigenous peoples with their sovereign rights to steward the land with fire and enable them, not just allow them, but give them resources to continue their cultural burning practices, revive them. Must convert wildland firefighters into fire rangers, work with fire in the land, prescribe fire or wildfire, work with it, stop fighting against it, fighting forest fires is basically fighting against Mother Nature. And and we are losing that fight. At the bottom here is another paper we put out on the FUSEE website, talking a little bit more about these connections between climate change, wildfire, and our vision of ecological fire management. And here's Smokey with Al Gore's face here. Really keep focused on the real burning issue, that's climate change. So thank you so much, everyone, for listening. Happy to answer questions.
All right, thank you so much. Just a reminder, anyone, if you have questions, please put them in the Q&A. We have a couple here already. This individual asks, can we fight back by talking about how many people and homes will be displaced or destroyed and put the liability on the Forest Service and logging interests?
Good question. And boy, my heart goes out to those people who lost their homes and have their whole lives upended. But let's, most homes are located on private lands. And that's not Forest Service land, that's private lands. And so it's a question, what is the Forest Service on public lands, and especially dealing with remote wildlands far away from homes and communities? How are they the ones protecting people on private lands? And what scientists have realized is that it's within just 100 feet or so of homes. That's where the fuels and combustibles in the home itself is most vulnerable. And we're doing some relatively simple things like keeping your rooftops clean of mats of dead needles and limbs, keeping flammable shrubs away from your walls, keeping your grasses and gardens green, removing combustibles like firewood piles stacked underneath your deck. Those things can have remarkable effects on protecting your home during wildfire. Those far more effective than some fuels reduction project 30 miles away on the hope that a wildfire might encounter. So the solution is first start with protecting and preparing our homes and communities. And once we get a handle on that, it opens up a lot more options and opportunities for how we engage and relate with fire on the larger landscape. So that's where the infrastructure bill should be focused, right there on homes and communities.
Awesome, thank you. Okay, this individual says, can any approach really make a difference with more frequent megafires, or what would?
Well, I want to stress that megafires is a media term, and there's some of my colleagues dispute using that because it sounds scary. Sounds like Mega Godzilla, right? These are large fires, but it's not like they're these moonscapes. It's not like there's this giant tsunami of flame rolling over the treetops, killing everything in its path. Again, these fires are large because they spread rapidly and mostly by embers, tiny little burnt embers, often smoke fall on the ground. So in these large fires, there's a whole range of fire effects. Large areas where the fire completely burned around or skipped over, they're green islands in these large fires, or they lightly underburn. Nature is kind of partly compensating for the fire deficit in these large fires. It's returning fire, but it's often during these extreme conditions that are very, very risky and hazardous to firefighters and ensnare homes and communities in their midst. So there's not much that we can do fighting against wildfires in extreme conditions, but there's a lot we can do in lighting prescribed fires during the best conditions for controlling their behavior and attaining desired effects. And that's what we need to kind of, the paradigm shift is like a gestalt shift. Stop fighting so many fires and start lighting a lot more fires. Particularly, we need to get more fire on the ground and whittle down some of those excess fuels and prepare the ground because climate change is just amping up and making these climate and weather conditions, fuel conditions more extreme. The window of opportunity rapidly shrinking. So, good question.
All right. Our next one saying, to clarify, are you saying ecological fire use practices are happening now, or the USFS plan you spoke about? Because they seem at odds with each other. Is the EFU a dream?
EFU or FU is a vision, okay? It's a vision, and some innovative fire managers are employing that on the ground, but it's, they're not boasting about it because, again, the media, politicians, most people want them to put the fire out, hit it hard, spare no cost, no impact. That's our vision, which should be the norm instead of the exception, but it's not the standard practice today.
Okay, perfect. What is your impression of policy movement in the Oregon legislature over the past year addressing the wildfire problem?
Well, good question. There was a massive fire bill, and FUSEE worked on just one part of that. That was establishing the Oregon Community Wildfire Protection Corps, hiring crews of young people to go work right in homes and communities. The home ignition zone is called, to reduce their vulnerability to fire. The most effective and efficient and inexpensive method for reducing the losses of homes and communities in wildfires. If we get our homes and communities prepared for fire, you can have extreme conditions, you can have large wildfires, you'll still be safe at home. And so fire safety does begin at home. And because it does on private lands, you don't have to wait for the Forest Service to do its environmental impact statement, if at all. Communities should be empowered to take care of their homes and properties. And it takes a village, it takes a whole community, because if you do your share and your neighbor doesn't, your neighbor's home is what's going to put you at risk. So I look at preparing for wildfires as a real community building activity.
So would you say new state investment in fire suppression is counterproductive? Or are any new state investments in forest thinning and prescribed burning constructive?
Well, prescribed burning, absolutely, because nothing influences fire like fire. And of course, that's the adage: fight fire with fire. Burn all the small diameter surface fuels is what those embers land in and ignite. What fires mostly spread. We need a lot more prescribed burning. But again, we need to focus on preparing homes and communities. We could do that in a 5-year plan with all those billions of infrastructure bucks. Get our homes and communities prepared for fire. We know we can't prevent all wildfires. We know we can't put them all out, but we can make it safe for people in their homes and communities to survive in a fire environment. We just ask ourselves, here in the homeland of the Kalapuya Ali'i people, who lived here 10,000 years with fires burning on landscape, they didn't own a single air tanker or engine or bulldozer. How did they survive? Because they steward the land with fire, and that provided protection of their settlements, their villages, communities, and the benefits of fire provided bounty, harvests, and hunts that sustain their culture and economies. And there's a lot to learn from the indigenous model of fire management and ecological fire use as an antidote to the imperial model of fire exclusion and fire control.
Awesome. Okay, this individual says, how do you think that separate federal agencies who may have different visions could cause more conflict than good? For example, the National Park Service's use of fire compared to the Forest Service's identity to only suppress fires immediately. Yeah,
there is potential conflict, but the Forest Service is the big green monster. The overwhelming amount of money and resources and power, prestige in fire flows through it, and it kind of tends to dominate other federal agencies. Very indicative. The Forest Service didn't feel any need or inclination to include other federal agencies or state agencies in its developing its wildfire crisis strategy, because, you know, empowered by all these billions of infrastructure bucks, it can go its own way. And its own way, again, is continued fire exclusion, keep fires out, and get the timber out. You know, and so I do want to say, though, that within the agency, there are some amazingly progressive scientists and managers who recognize the problems with the old paradigm, are striving to help the agency embrace the new paradigm, and coming up with amazing ideas of how to do real ecological fuels treatments for the sake of reintroducing and living and working with fire instead of continually fighting it. And I want to give them credit.
Are there any federal agencies or other groups that you think would interact best to make this strategy more successful?
What would make the strategy more successful is a real collaboration between agencies and communities. We just got to end the monopolization of fire management by the government and include communities. And I'm not just including private contractors, which is where the wildfire crisis strategy is going to be rolling out first. The Forest Service just doesn't have the people to implement it. They're going to be, you know, passing through all these taxpayer dollars to private contractors, which, you know, some of them will do good work, but most of them are in it for profit. So they'll meet their minimum specifications for maximum profit and they're gone. The people who live in these environments have stakes in success. They're the ones who got to be involved. So we got to break that monopolization that between the government, the people, and get us involved. The government has the experts, technical experts, and the people have the labor, the communities have the labor power, and that's what should happen.
With a growing wildland urban interface, do we minimize homes being built into the wilderness, or do we just increase our WUI protection tactics, like you said?
Well, land use laws has a major role in, you know, reducing people who put themselves at risk, you know, exposed, living in fire prone environments, and they never realize that. And there's a problem that, you know, local governments, county commissioners, whatever, you know, they got vested stakes in promoting development, rural sprawl. They get more tax revenue, you know, the building permits, whatever, tax dollars, and they don't pay the bills. And they're not the ones out there fighting the fires, putting themselves at risk when fires can and inevitably come. So Oregon has land use laws and zoning that's very progressive. It can do better. Many states in the West, it's open season. And, you know, this is like we exalt private property rights, and we, you know, without, you know, community, you know, property, or, you know, responsibilities, and we don't give any rights or, you know, or role to nature. So that we can do better with land use zoning to prevent people from sprawling into fire-prone environments. That's another big big solution.
Thank you. Okay, this individual asks, are there any examples of successful collaboration of local communities and the Forest Service on community protection?
Well, I will cite the example in Ashland, which years ago, the Forest Service came up with this, I mean, there's Ashland in Southern Oregon, much at risk. They're built at the base and kind of crawling up into very steep, densely forested areas, very erosive soils. The Ashland community loves their forest, loves their watershed, and it's at high risk from climate and wildfires. So the Forest Service came up with this idea: we're going to cut fuel breaks way in the back country. It's where we're going to fight fires. Community said no, you know, and it took many years, but with the help of a progressive district ranger and very committed community, it turned the Forest Service around. And I think they came up with some things that they're doing some cutting and burning in the watershed in ways that will increase the, you know, protection of the communities and protection of the watershed. The cutting and burning is not the same thing as logging and firefighting. So that's one thing is a lot of these fuels treatments, again, the scientists, they're barely 1 to 4% ever encounter wildfire. What's the point? Within a few years, things grow back and it's no longer a fuels treatment. So there's one way to make that 100%. 100% of every fuels treatment will encounter a fire if it's used as the anchor for lighting prescribed fire, or if it's used as the base to take some action in wildfire, besides suppressing it, but, you know, working with it. So that's another way we shift the paradigm here, is make, I wouldn't even call them fuel breaks, but these treatments as means of reintroducing fire, and instead of excluding fire.
Awesome. Okay, this individual asks, how has urban wildland interface fire safety planning in places like Eugene changed over the past few years, or is it perhaps planned to change to help mitigate megafires like the 2020 Holiday Farm fire from spreading into and through the metropolitan area? Is that possible or not possible?
Yeah, I'm not sure I understood the whole question, but the Holiday Farm fire 2020 during Labor Day, wake-up call. People used to laugh at me. I've been here for years and said, Tim, you work with fire. Where are you living in Eugene? There are no fires in Eugene. No, climate change is really alter that. Lulled, false sense of security, right? So I credit city leaders and local fire marshal doing a lot to educate homeowners. There's a lot you can do to prepare for fires. I mean, it's not just the outer rim of cities that are vulnerable. Embers, loft can drop in the middle of the city, could drop in a city park, ignite something, land on someone's roof, you know, with trees and branches and shrubs, all kind of hands. So there's a lot that we can do to prepare for homes as a community, and you know, dealing with smoke and developing smoke shelters for smoke sensitive people, and evacuation routes and all that kind of stuff. Reduce all those power lines that are just polluting the skyscape and our prime ignition sources in windstorms or ice storms.
Okay. Let's see. This individual says prescribed fire produces no commercially marketable product. What is the economic value added from investment in prescribed fire?
Well, you can look at the economic value of management projects as what kind of revenue can you pull out of the forest, or what kind of taxpayer costs can you minimize getting into the forest. There is nothing cheaper than fire on a per acre basis. Nothing, you know, big machines cost big bucks, and you know, perhaps on a per acre basis, wildfire suppression, the most expensive activity we do at all. Pure cost, no revenue. So, you know, and we're just, suppression costs are soaring, billions of dollars every year. And becoming more off budget. We're just so that's, we might want to think like that. Where is the best investment of this money, and the best investment in a way that reduces costs, not just the costs of the management project, but perhaps future costs of wildfires that might burn during extreme conditions and such. That is applying some kind of fire, and that's by far the cheapest. So it's not so much what kind of money can we make from a project. That is, again, the kind of focus of our politicians and our government agencies and it's what kind of money can we save from doing projects that are good for the land and better for taxpayers' pocketbooks.
Okay. This individual says, thanks for the fragmenting forest side. I was going to ask how much clear-cut logging goes on during fire suppression outside of environmental review?
Wonderful question. I didn't even get a chance to address that. And that is really terrible. But, you know, in some forests, the agency is under the smoke screen of wildfire suppression. They're doing logging. They're using feller bunchers to cut down saw logs, cut them to merchantable deck them, and then haul them out as fuels reduction during a wildfire, which is a state of emergency, and NEPA does not apply. So you don't have to do any scientific analysis. You don't have to do any public impact, public comment. You can exclude the public from their own lands, which is very common. I mean, some huge areas of the Land National Forest are still closed 2 years after the Holiday Farm Fire. And, you know, and so that has been increasing, and it's something that must be exposed and put a stop to. And beyond, you know, cutting down big trees for saw logs, just in my day as a firefighter, you know, you get some of these fallers and they call it recreational falling. You know, they could cut down big trees. It's a big adrenaline rush. It's, you know, it can't come down any other circumstance, legally at least. But during fire suppression, they cut down the big giants. It's sometimes these big snags full of hollows that are decaying. They'll catch an ember, they get on fire. These are some of the most valuable trees in the forest in terms of habitat. If there's any tree that we should try to prevent from burning and falling down, it's these big old snags, but they're the first to go in firefighting. Search and destroy. And so that's a really good question. And I think it's a growing scandal that should be exposed and stopped.
Awesome. I think along those lines too, you had mentioned the aerial retardant. Would you say that's more of a hurt than a help?
You know, in more cases, and this is Forest Service's own research, they're dumping that stuff by the tens of millions of gallons every year in the wrong times, places, and conditions. It's best on relatively flat ground, sparsely vegetated in the cool of the morning. And they're dumping this on steep, vegetated slopes in the heat of the afternoon. It may not even reach the ground. You know, it gets hung up in the air or it gets vaporized before it lands. And so it's not really helping in terms of stopping fire spread. In fact, it can't stop fire spread. It slows fire spread. It's a retardant, not an extinguisher. And it's being dumped in places there are no crews on the ground ready to put fire line in to stop the fire spread. So it's a great spectacle. Makes great film at 11. Demonstrates to the public your government at work. But it's you might as well be dropping dollar bills out of the sky. It's a waste. If it was just a waste of money, that'd be one thing. But when that toxic stuff flushes into the streams and especially lakes and ponds, it kills, you know, living things in riparian areas and it alters soil chemistry. But just on that note, there's much to do about all the heroic firefighting efforts on the shores of Lake Tahoe, you know, that stopped the Calder fire spread. Wait till all that retardant starts oozing into the lake and you'll just see some big algae blooms in the bays near there. And I fear for that. But again, there's really no free lunch when it comes to fighting fires. There's collateral damage. And even retardant is one of them.
This individual asks, how persistent is the fire retardant?
That's a good question. And, I suppose over time it flushes through a system. I mean, it can accumulate in like still bodies of water, municipal water systems that draw out of reservoirs. If retardant gets in there, it kind of, feeds algae blooms and it alters chemistry. It may last a couple years till all that water is kind of flushed through. If it alters the soil chemistry and it gives a foothold to invasive weeds, well, they can outcompete, native species, and then that may be kind of converting that community, and that might last for a while. It's hard to say. It's not the impacts of fire retardant not as long lasting as dozer lines, which are almost permanent scars on the landscape. And all that soil oozes into, fish habitat and stuff. But, it has, some impact. It lasts some time. And, again, if it's not really stopping fire spread, not putting it out, that's supposedly its intended, effect. It is kind of a waste of money, resources, has its impacts, and I want to add, it puts those crews at risk. And that is what's happening a lot these days in the conditions that it's too unsafe to put ground crews at work. They're shifting that risk to air crews, and they're sending them to fly just to show the public, we got to do something. Okay, let's just, send a retardant drop. And those pilots are the ones putting their lives at risk in those kind of conditions.
Thank you. Okay, this individual asks, what do you think of not fighting fires at all and putting all the money into home hardening?
Well, we'll always have a need for some kind of fire suppression. You can't just stop it cold. We can shift though, so the majority of our resource and the focus is on protecting homes and communities first. That will allow us more options and opportunities how we engage fire. But somehow we've distorted the definition of suppression to mean stopping fire spread and putting it out, when another way to define it is suppressing fire behavior. Make it less extreme, less intense, suppressing maybe uncharacteristic severity. And so it doesn't necessarily suppress its spatial extent, its temporal duration, but suppresses, maybe flame lengths or heat output or the kind of intensity and severity. That's a different way of redefining fire suppression. And I would call that more fire management than fire suppression.
Okay. How do you think the Forest Service can take the first step to get away from the militaristic management they feel they need to uphold and change the public's view on what they're being paid to do?
Well, I would say why have the Forest Service the first step? That is a culture-wide shift that needs to happen. And it just our whole, right out of the Western Enlightenment, okay, mastery of nature, control over nature. It is true that we framed it as kind of the moral equivalent of war when it comes to firefighting, but it's not moral, and it's even a false equivalent to war. And so I'm hoping that first changing our language, stop talking about firefighting, start talking about fire managing. If we change our language, we can change a little bit of our mentality. And along with the change of mentality, we change some of our behaviors, reframe that. We shouldn't be talking about firefighters, even though that's in our name. We were working for the day when that's as anachronistic as calling them smoke chasers, or, it's like nobody calls them that anymore. We call them fire rangers. And so that's a whole culture wide change needs to happen. And the Forest Service could perhaps play a leading role in changing some of its language and really shifting its paradigm in how it engages fire and fuels. But, ending the war metaphor, the catastrophe mentality, there's a lot of other players guilty of that too. The news media, number one, loves war reporting, one war or another. And politicians, well, that's the last thing we need when there's lots of wildfires burning, is hot air blowing from politicians. It's not productive, not helpful. So they got to get out of that mentality too. But very good question.
Okay. So a little bit of a shift here. This individual has looked at your website, the FUSEE website. She says it looks great. But asked if there's any specific ideas or tips for homeowners and communities on how to keep their homes safe from fires.
That's not featured on our website so much. We're working on that. Profiling rural homeowners who are doing their share, and they're kind of model citizens for living in a fire environment. Well, there's many other organizations and their websites, the National Fire Protection Association, NFPA, the Fire Safe, FireWise program, and Fire Safe Communities, the Fire Adapted Communities Learning Network. These are some entities that are doing a lot of good homeowner education on that. But I do want to stress, a lot of that education is all focused on the individual homeowner, individual property owner. That's necessary, but insufficient. We got to start thinking holistically as communities, neighbor to neighbor, helping each other out. That's why I'm really proud of the Oregon Community Wildfire Protection Corps, a model program set up in Oregon from last year's legislation, getting young people who are the next generation of fire stewards, helping reduce the vulnerability of rural homeowners, particularly those who lack the capacity to do that themselves. Elderly people, disabled people, poor people, communities of color. They're the ones who get first dibs on these young, strong bodies who can climb up on roofs and prune shrubs and haul out firewood and do all that necessary, work to enable you to feel safe and live sustainably in a fire-prone environment. So lots of places to go and get that kind of tips and advice. And FUSEE is going to amp up its own work on that. We really need a partnership between homeowners and firefighters working together, each doing our share.
Awesome. Thank you so much. I know we just have a couple minutes left, so if there's any final point that you would love to make, and if there's another question that comes in during that time.
Well, I'll say this. Wildland firefighters, they're the ones with the most stakes in a safe and sound and sane, sustainable fire policy. And all these projects that are still oriented towards amping up the war on wildfire, tamping down on fire exclusion, doing these fuels reduction projects that in some ways make areas more flammable, and is not doing them any favors. And they really need our support, and more support than putting "Thank You Heroes" on a banner when they're getting their butts kicked in these kind of extreme fire conditions. They need to know that you've done your share making your homes and communities prepared for fire, because that will lower a lot of their intensity. And they need to know that, every wildland firefighter is someone's son or daughter. And so you parents out there, I know you're worried. It's time you start advocating for the wise use of your hard-earned tax dollars, doing things that will make your children, safer. And just giving them bigger engines and bigger air tankers and bigger bulldozers is not working, and is not making them more safe. It's just putting them in danger. So there's a lot that all of us can do. Perhaps our politicians and our news media and maybe some of our high level government officials will be the last to get on board with a new paradigm. But really, we generally need a new paradigm shift. That's what the Forest Service wildfire crisis strategy claims it's about. I argue it's not about. We need a new wildfire. We need a new paradigm shift, and that means all of us. You know, and the whole all of us need to be part of that. So appreciate.
Awesome. Yeah, thank you so much. Thank you for your time, and everyone, thank you so much for joining this panel, and have a great evening.
Yes. Thank you very much.